Welcome to Elée's Podcasts, the meeting point where experts and enthusiasts come together to explore the world of software asset management, cloud, and IT. Ready to become masters in the field? Keep your ears open and let yourself be guided through this fascinating universe.
Well, hello everyone. Today we're going to talk, unusually for us, about telecom and network costs. So I'm joined by Jean-Pascal. Hello, Jean-Pascal.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jean-Pascal. And indeed, you are a specialist in telecom and network monitoring, and we're going to talk about your field. But maybe to start, let's talk about some IT costs. We know they're constantly rising and that companies face a real challenge in managing their budgets given their dependency, growing reliance on technology and its quality. Can you give us some indicators like percentage increases or figures on unspent budgets or waste? A few insights before you introduce yourself at Oncept.
Yes, absolutely. So, strangely enough, telecom isn't an area where the unit cost necessarily increases. For about the past 15 years, we've seen unit costs for telecoms go down more or less steadily, pretty much everywhere in the world. Of course, consumption is increasing, which means IT budgets don't necessarily go down. But when it comes to unit costs, we see reductions ranging from 5 to 10% per year, sometimes much more, depending on the region and the technology. There are parts of the world in the Middle East, certain Asian countries, where you can see cost reductions of around 20% per year. These are markets that historically have been very, very expensive in terms of unit cost per megabit. So there's space to see cost reductions. And it's actually an opportunity for companies to capitalize, not to wait 3 or 5 years until the end of contracts to try to get to prices that are a bit more regular, a bit more normal in terms of the market.
So could you share how Oncept is currently positioned and also what is it that you do at Oncept?
That's a good question. So Oncept, we specialize in telecom benchmarking worldwide. The idea actually is that most global and multinational companies have telecom usage all over the world. Each market is different, and each of these markets actually has its own logic, unique in terms of cost dynamics. So what we do is we have a methodology that allows us to benchmark based on contract duration, contract type, what is being purchased, purchasing power, and so on. On a more or less global scale, we cover almost 150 countries. And we actually began this about approximately 20 years ago. That was when we realized that, in fact, the costs of transoceanic communications were dropping much faster than anyone could have imagined. This started around 1998, 1999, 2000, and we realized that multinational companies didn't know the prices and very often were at the mercy of their service providers or didn't know how to choose the right service provider for their requests and for their needs. In general, they would go to the local service provider. If you were German, you would go to Deutsche Telekom. If you were French, you would go to Orange. Even though there were providers who were much more capable of offering solutions that were ultimately better suited. So that's our goal at Oncept, to do benchmarking, to help with procurement, with sourcing telecom products, and then to help companies negotiate their contracts and to provide some transparency about what they're paying and where they're paying it.
Okay, so unlike the software market where unit prices are constantly rising, you have a telecommunications market that's actually going down in value. But where do you even start? Because telecom and network contracts can also be extremely complex. How do you go about it? Any ideas on how to actually start projecting a company's overall spending decrease?
Yes, so there's a bit of a detective aspect to this job. Depending on the company's needs, their region, and the demand, we usually have some ideas about where to start looking. Very often it's the offices and manufacturing sites in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. In Eastern Europe, that's where we start looking. But at the beginning, there's a detective effort, which is actually about creating that famous list. We realize that many multinational companies don't really have a very precise inventory. Sometimes it's just something found on some random Excel sheet. The person who was in charge of the Excel sheet retired last year. No one really took over after they retired. And then you find yourself in an environment where you really have to learn what you have before you can actually negotiate. So at the beginning, there's a real research effort, and we focus the search based on the areas and the client's needs. So a European multinational company with offices in the United States, a research center in the US, maybe some outsourcing in India, and then sales offices all over the place. We'll most likely start with India or China, and then we'll really help them figure out what they have and also point out where the potential cost savings are.
What surprises your clients the most when you work with them?
The magnitude, the gap, as we say in English, between what they pay and what they could be paying. So
They're all convinced they're always getting the best prices?
yes, everyone is always convinced they have a well-managed inventory, that they have the right prices, and that they have exceptional relationships with their service providers. And we realize that it's really no one's fault. These are markets that are declining. And since we can't afford to make 6-month contracts and renew them every 6 months, we see that people who negotiated their contracts 2 or 3 years ago now find themselves out of sync with the market. It's really no one's fault. Actually, the fault lies in not watching the market, in not questioning yourself every year and going back to your provider and saying, well, last year in Dubai, it was 10,000 euros for my connection. Now maybe it's worth 6 or 7. What can we do? The range of possibilities in general, that's usually the first surprise. The second surprise we usually have is the speed at which these savings can be achieved. Often it's just contractual, meaning there's no need to bring in new lines, no need to make an offer or launch an international tender. You can simply go to your provider and say, prices have changed. What can we do? And why wouldn't we trade a cost reduction for a longer contract term? We give you a bit more duration, but in return, you give us a little bit of savings today.
So when you say it can be very quick, what do you mean? Are we talking about a month, a quarter?
A week? Yes, it's usually within a quarter. Of course, there are some extreme cases. Not long ago, for example, we managed to recover a few hundred, well, almost 600,000 euros for a client in just 20 days, but that's rare. Generally, the detective work, the effort to figure out what we have, to really understand, to do the benchmarking, that's on a quarterly scale. That's pretty reasonable.
And you see, in overall negotiations, in procurement matters, there's often I have a strong belief. I know I can get a certain price, but that doesn't mean the supplier will actually give it to me. I feel like in telecom, in the network sector, it's a bit different.
Yes, credibility definitely comes into play, especially when we are discussing information. Sometimes we work with partners who just buy benchmarks and try to negotiate on their own. And it's true that when we turn to our service provider and say, I have a good report that says my telecoms are worth 10 euros each, the credibility isn't necessarily there. That being said, once we've primed the pump a bit and we're working with suppliers who know that every year prices are exactly where they should be, that there's enough margin for them, that it's not extortion, there tends to be a bit of to just go with the flow and say, well, yes, that's where the market is, so why don't we just work it out? The problem is more about information than negotiation. The first negotiation is difficult because everyone needs to realize that everyone knows the market prices. But once that's done, it's a bit easier than in software.
And how does it work with your clients? Do you do the inventory, the positioning, the benchmarking, and you also handle the negotiation? But where do the limits of responsibility, or rather the workload with your clients, lie?
So the boundaries are defined during the contract, but practically speaking, the detective work is usually done by both us and them because we need access to their data. The benchmarking is 100% on us. When it comes to negotiation, we can do actually 3 different models. We have the model where we're a bit in the background and we feed some of the answers so that the client's own team can go and negotiate.
That helps them build their skills. That's what it's about. Yes, exactly.
There's the model where we're really sitting at the same table. We're at the negotiation table and we share the responsibilities a bit. And then there's the fully outsourced model. We now have clients, large tech companies who have trusted us for about 20 years and now just tell us, go ahead, you handle it.
So they've completely outsourced this telco network procurement part.
Yes. And we occasionally have this happen for companies, especially in certain situations that you wouldn't expect unless you knew. It's
Not the local small business.
not the local small business, it's the CAC 40, it's the Fortune 100, who in the end you tell us, well, yes, now we've been doing this with you for 20 years, why don't you just handle it? And the service providers know us and they know very well that we represent this or that company, and at that point it's completely seamless. Yes.
So what is the promise in terms of results, if you can give some more precise ballpark figures?
So the promise, well, it really depends on the footprint. It really depends on where people are located. We have a little calculator that we use in the background to get a rough idea. But typically, if we know nothing, if we know absolutely nothing about the client's profile, their needs, or the age of their contracts, we always say on average 10% per year. That's roughly what we see. If you're in Dubai, it's 30%. If you're in the United States last year, it's more like 5%. If you were in Ireland, it's more like 15%. But we have this sort of tool, this little calculator that we use, so we can give the client some results a bit in advance by saying, based on what we've understood, it will fall within this range of what we hope to find. But we also have clients who really want to put us in the same boat as them, actually, and who say to us, why don't we do gain sharing? Why don't we share the costs, the savings? So that's another model. But if we know nothing or have no prior information, then on average, 10% per year globally isn't a bad figure.
Yes, that's already very good considering the overall spending on telcos and even IT. It's always something gained. Given budget constraints, we also tend to say at Elée that gain share, success fees, call it what you want, its profit sharing is a challenge for human relationships. How do you manage to build client loyalty? Because you said you've been doing this for 20 years. How do you actually establish that position and maybe turn it into a managed service? Thank you. You outsource a part of it. How do you manage that aspect, which is extremely complex?
Actually, the way to manage it is not to manage it. What we see is that very often in the first year, the client doesn't necessarily have a budget. So gain share is the only way to get started. But very, very quickly, we try to switch to a fixed fee model, because first, it allows us to stay a little more detached. Second, it helps avoid surprises, because no matter what the gain share percentage is, if there's a cost reduction of several million euros, there's always someone who will look at it and say, wait a minute, you're taking this percentage of so many millions, you spent 50 hours on it, that's not worth it. So at that point, generally in years 2, 3, 4, and 5, we switch to a fixed fee. By then, we have a good understanding of the size of the company. We know very well how it operates. And then there will be years when we're a bit overwhelmed and years when we're less so, but overall it balances out. But I completely agree that gain sharing is a bit of a trap, especially in markets that are dropping so quickly, because our effort, whether we like it or not, is still time spent. And even though we're bringing in value, there's always someone behind the scenes who will ask themselves, but how much does that come out to per hour? And I think that's when you need to keep the client's objective in mind. The client's goal is to compensate us in a fair and not excessive way. And for us, our goal is to be here for 20 years. Having a big gain share in year 1, 2, or 3, and then not being around after that isn't really in our interest.
Okay. Before we wrap up, are there any other services? Training, things like that, coaching? Do you offer those kinds of things as well, or are you really focused on pure expertise and the internal teams get trained just by working with you?
No, so we do provide assistance with negotiations, and we can also do training. We have some multinationals where we do that, which have telecom purchasing teams of 40 or 50 people. These teams usually have a high turnover, not necessarily because of outsourcing to India or elsewhere, but It's a field where people move around more than in others. So we do training, we give courses, help with negotiations. So that's pretty standard. And then there's a part that actually flows naturally from these initial commitments where we really do expense management, to use some franglais. We take care of the entire list of services. We negotiate contracts when they need to be negotiated. We provide visibility. We can also help manage invoices and handle contract renewals, and ultimately do everything that involves interfacing with service providers. That usually happens in the second phase. It's rarely the first contract, but there comes a point when we're so involved with the company that we end up taking care of everything that used to be handled as a whole. And then it becomes a bit like outsourcing or procurement, to use another term, another English word.
Okay, JP, thank you. Would you like to add a word before we wrap up this conversation?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, thank you for the invitation, but I also think there's something quite interesting about both of our professions. That is what we often see is partners or clients who come to us saying, can you help us find cost savings in telecom because my software costs are rising, because my needs are increasing, because my costs are going up, etc. So we often see this kind of synergy happening where we start by reducing telecom expenses to free up budget for other things. And now this is a model that we are seeing more and more frequently. We see it with the major service providers as well, who often say that they've found a way to free up a bit of budget for our CIOs and thereby allow them to invest in other important things. So I think that's where things are heading, and that's kind of the indirect value of what both of us are doing. There's a synergy that's very beneficial for our mutual clients. Yes, of course.
You're right, because for those who will be listening to this podcast, we're launching a new offer. At Elée, in the beginning, we only did software. We do software asset management, and since 2018, we've been handling software and cloud purchases. We're often asked, help us for everything related to IT. And actually, we really connected with you and your teams, JP, because you are, well, to use a bit of franglais, you're independent, and independence has tremendous value for us. In reality, we complement each other with our software cost optimization program and your telecom cost optimization. And then we're going to also go a bit further into the hardware side and the service provider side. And so we're really starting to look at overall IT cost reduction. So we'll be able to offer a bit more to our clients who often ask us for more. And so we'll be happy to generate savings both on telecoms and maybe on software as well.
Yes, absolutely. And I completely agree about independence. I believe there's tremendous value in this independence, which means there are no commissions, no bias. The market is the market. Our clients pay us to help them, and we can have this completely independent perspective that actually helps everyone in our case. And that's why I think our teams work well together, because we think the same way.
Thank you, JP, for your time, and see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.